person. It's a great honour to be here. This is a place that has shaped me. Names like John O'Neill and Duncan Forrester, that I know are precious to many people in this room, are the people who formed my theological imagination. So it's a great honour to stand where they've stood so many times. I'm going to do three things. I'm going to preach, I'm going to talk about preaching, and then I'm going to take questions. But before I do that, I'd like you to read the passage from Isaiah 43. You've got it in your packs. And if you're good at reading fuzzy writing, you can even read it from the screen. But I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read through that. Is this one? Not long ago, I was doing a live broadcast on the radio. Just before I came on, the producer brought in the man who was next on after me. Now, speaking live to about 5 million people can be quite sobering, but this man was about as nervous as anybody I've ever seen. His hands were shaking so much he could hardly keep hold of the piece of paper on which he'd typed out the things he really didn't want to forget. The creases on the slip of paper indicated how much he'd fretted over it the night before. But on it were 5 short lines. And that struck me. If you were about to face the scariest conversation of your life, and the night before you were too nervous to write an aide-memoire, so you typed 5 short lines, I wonder what they'd say. Israel in Babylon was facing the scariest time of its life. And on a piece of parchment or some kind of a scroll, the prophet Isaiah recorded the 5 things Israel needed to remember. In the fashion of a number of scriptural passages, they're written in a chiastic structure. That's to say, the first line is echoed by the last line, the second by the penultimate line, the third by the third line from the end, and so on. So the 5th line, the one right in the middle, is the one that really counts. It becomes like the point of an arrow. I want to look at the 5 things Isaiah tells us, because I've got a hunch they're not just speaking to exiles in the 6th century BC. They're speaking to you and me right here, right now. The first thing is, God created you. That's created, not manufactured. Everything manufactured is a product. Everything created is a miracle. Your creation in the womb is like the creation of the world. It's a thing of limitless wonder, complexity, care, a mixture of biology and poetry, a blend of the physical and the spiritual. And it happens not randomly, but for a reason. God made you because God wanted you and had a job that only you could do. And it says God formed you. So creation wasn't a once-for-all thing. God continues to craft you like a potter with clay on the wheel, deftly and painstakingly, with wisdom and skill and attention. Then the second line on the scrap of paper is, God has set you free. This part really goes into the depths of our soul. It says, do not fear. Everywhere in the Bible, people encounter God and they're terrified. They're terrified by God's holiness, but also by their own shortcomings. Do not fear means God sees you, God knows you, God understands you, God forgives you. You don't have to have any secrets from God. You don't have to play your usual games. God's beyond that and sees you beyond all that. God has redeemed you. I don't know if you've had the experience of being in a restaurant and you get a bit greedy and the food all costs more than you meant it to, and you start the edgy process of asking for the bill and wondering how you'll divide it up, and then your companion comes back from the loo and you find they've already paid the lot. You feel embarrassed and grateful and relieved all at the same time. God has redeemed you. You've been set free. The wrong you've done is forgiven. The damage you've done, God is putting right. The hurt you've inflicted, God is healing. But your fear isn't just that your wrongdoing will catch you out. Your deeper fear is that your life is meaningless, that you have no ultimate significance and belong nowhere. God says, I have called you by name. You are mine. You know how they say a mother can recognize her baby's cry even in a crowded room? That's how God knows you. God made everyone but regards you as if you were the only one. God has called you by name. When someone remembers your name, you know either that they're very special or that you're very special to them. God knows your name, your real name, not the one everyone else calls you. Your real and intimate name. And you belong to God. You may feel you've spent your whole life not fitting in, wrong face, wrong time, wrong manners, wrong accent, wrong looks, wrong everything. Now you belong. And belonging in God, you are everywhere at home. Some people say, there's always a place for you at my table, always a place on my sofa, always a bed if you're thrown out. That's what God says. But with God, it's forever. You are mine. And the third line on Isaiah's parchment is, I am with you. Now notice what this says and what it doesn't say. It doesn't say bad things won't happen. You'll be deluged by seas, you'll be flooded by rivers, you'll be beset by fire and fire alarms. Tragedy, disaster, conflict, and defeat will happen. There's no promise here that you'll live a charmed life and nothing will worry your pretty little head. But see what it does say. You'll be deluged by seas, but you'll pass through them, and I'll be with you. You'll be flooded by rivers, but they'll not overwhelm you, and I'll be with you. You'll be beset by fire and flame, but it won't burn you up or consume you, and I'll be with you. You'll face pain, terror, loss, grief, shame, horror, calamity, but I'll be with you. I'll hold your hand. I'll walk with you. I'll be there. I'll never leave you alone. A while ago, I had a very painful surgery, about 2 years to the day. When I came round, I was hyperventilating and was convulsed with tears. And the friend who'd accompanied me to the hospital just gave me the most enormous hug. He said nothing, but enveloped me in sweater and shoulder and everlasting arms. That hug said, you've done a hard thing, but I'm here. It still hurt, but that hug said, you're not alone, I'm with you. I haven't forgotten that hug. I never will. God says, I'm with you. The fourth line on the scrap of paper is more mysterious. It seems to be about God exchanging one people for another. But you don't have to have a scholarly knowledge of ancient Near Eastern archaeology to get what it's saying. God says, I'll make sacrifices for you. To be with you, I'll give up some other important and valuable things. I could be elsewhere, in richer places, more comfortable surroundings, softer touches, easier rides. I know you. To be with you isn't going to be a rose garden, but I'm going to do it anyway. And in the New Testament, that language of I'll give up everything for you takes on a whole new dimension. In Jesus, God really does give up everything for us. And that brings us to the fifth line on the parchment. There's a reason why Isaiah doesn't start here. It's partly a historical reason. What we've read so far more or less works its way through the Old Testament and through the story of Israel. The creation to start with, then the liberation from Egypt, then the covenant on Sinai in which God says, I'll be with you, then the cost of God choosing Israel when Israel is what they call in the northeast of England a worky ticket, like a niggly soccer player, goading the referee to send him off. But it's partly also a psychological reason. God says, I made you. I saved you. I'm with you. I gave up everything for you. And it begs the question, why? It's a question that comes out of gratitude because what God's articulating is grace, totally unearned, unwarranted, undeserved relationship and blessing. It's also a question that comes out of skepticism. Why, knowing what I'm like, would anyone say such things to me? What's the catch? What's the letdown at the end of all this glory? So the fifth line is the answer to this suspicious yet grateful, mystified yet humble question. Why am I all these things to you? And this is God's answer. You can only really do this answer justice if you imagine both parties in tears. You in tears because you've been trembling with a fear and doubt since your first conscious breath, a fear that there was no meaning and a doubt that if there was, you'd be included in it. And God in tears because it takes so many ways and so many times to persuade you and encourage you and show you. Here are the words that are at the center of Scripture, the essence of Christianity, the heart of it all. Because, says God to you, you are precious in my sight and honored, and I love you. First two words complement each other. You are precious means you are of infinite value. You are unique. You are without compare. You are honored means I respect you. You have your own integrity. There's more to you than simply your relationship with me. And then the final word, and I love you. You need all three words. I don't know if anyone's ever told you they love you when it was clear they didn't honor you. It's actually not very nice at all. And to be loved and honored is great. But without the precious, it makes you feel the person's just being kind. Precious, honored, loved. You need all three. And this is where what I earlier called the chiastic structure of Isaiah's words really works. Because we're all familiar with the phrase, God loves you, and how shallow and superficial it can sound. But it's not shallow here, because it's the climax of these 5 layers of glory. And then those 5 layers cascade back down in more or less reverse order once we've reached the top of the mountain. This we see is where love comes from. And this we go on to see is what love entails. To say I love you only means something if it's the last piece in the jigsaw, backed up by actions and faithfulness and promises kept and commitment proved. So here are the 5 memory phrases about God according to Isaiah. I crafted you. I set you free. I'm with you. I gave up everything for you. I love you. So in reverse order, I gave up everything for you. I'm with you. I saved you. I formed you. Imagine the shape of this poem as an arrow with the 5th phrase, you are precious, honored, and loved, as the point of the arrow. And where is that arrow pointing? It's pointing right at Jesus. At Jesus' baptism, the voice from heaven says almost the very same words, you are my Son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased. Precious, honored, and loved. And at Jesus' baptism, there are the voice and waters of the Spirit of creation, the parted river of liberation, the solidarity of Jesus being with us, and these precious and honored words of love. Jesus' baptism is the performance by God, the Holy Trinity, of the prophecy of Isaiah 43. Remember, those 5 declarations that God made to Isaiah, that the voice said to Jesus, and that the Spirit whispers to you. Write them or type them onto paper and seal them on the inside of your soul. Remember them in the scariest moment of your life. They are the heart of it all. You are precious, honored, and loved, now and forever. Part 2. I'm going to talk about 4 stages in the life of a sermon. I'm going to call them preparing, I beg your pardon, I'm going to call them before preparing, writing and revising, and delivering. And I'm going to call this part of my remarks good to great, because I imagine everyone's come here today because they know they can prepare a good sermon, but they want to know how to prepare a great one, or maybe several hundred great ones. I'm going to make some suggestions with reference to the sermon I've just preached. Before preparing. There are broadly 4 moments of receiving a sermon. One is the live experience in the midst of liturgy, embedded in the hearer's personal circumstances, the community's events, and wider national and international dramas. The second is the memory of that sermon as it plays in the listener's heart later that day, week, year, decade, lifetime, as they read that scriptural text again, as they face that crisis of which you spoke, as they hear another sermon on that text. The third is the preacher's ongoing relationship with the listener as they hear others of your sermons, as they compare them to the sermon in life of your pastoral example and practice, as they measure up their notion of God and the church and the kingdom with the one you portrayed that day. The last is a relatively new phenomenon. It's the experience of the person who wasn't there on the day but comes across your sermon on a YouTube video, on a podcast recording, as a text on a website or a blog, or even just possibly a hard copy lovingly sent by their affectionate but anxious granny. Here's the first question. What do I want the congregation to experience as they listen, remember, digest, or as they engage third hand? I suggest you want them to remember the interplay of 2 things. On the one hand, there's the intimacy of God. God is talking to me, knows my struggles, understands who I am, and loves me. The siren calls of Albinoni or Mendelssohn are really God calling to me. My tussles in desire and longing and frustration and grief are really tussles with the angel of the Lord. God is as close to me as my heart is to my soul, and God loves me in a way I will never love myself. Put clumsily in cliché, platitude, or heartless theodicy, these truths are worse than useless. Whispered gently across the pillow of trust and tenderness, these are life-changing discoveries. All the more so because a horrifyingly high percentage of Christians have somehow been inculcated with a very different message from pastor or parent. On the other hand, there's the awesomeness of God. God is Lord of the universe. God's story encompasses every story. God is beyond, beneath, and above. It's lovely to believe God knows us and loves us immeasurably better than we know or love ourselves. But it's just as important to remember that this one who knows and loves us is the creator and redeemer of the universe. Christianity is the place where these 2 convictions meet. And here's the crucial part. The intimacy increases the awe, not the opposite. With film stars, Nobel Prize winners, or former princesses, you tend to find that the greater the intimacy, the less the awe. You just don't want to know about the tawdriness of their real complex lives. Come on, Donald, what's it really like? I don't want to know. But with God, the awe and the intimacy go together. God is completely intimate and completely cosmic. Preaching is about communicating both and their interplay with one another in thrilling terms. Afterwards, you want an intimate silence and an awed hush. You want people to be saying things like, I never realized. When I was 19, I went to Yellowstone Park. I didn't really know much about it except for the famous geyser Old Faithful. So when I followed a sign that said Scenic Viewpoint and walked around a rocky outcrop and saw the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen, I had this most amazing sense of grace, because I hadn't realized there was such a thing as the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. But I'd stumbled into it, and I knew I'd never forget it. I had no idea. That's what you want your congregation to say. That's the awe. But what about the intimacy? I recently spent some time with a doctor friend who works in a Malawian government hospital. She described one ward round of 3 hours, seeing 56 patients sharing 32 beds. 3/4 of the patients had HIV. This is what she said. The first call was to the diarrhea side room, a sobering array of wasted bodies and sunken eyes. The floor was wet with poorly mopped spills from bedpans. The first bay was reserved for patients with meningitis, strokes, or paraplegia. I crawled half under a bed with a house officer to show him the sensory level of a man with paraplegia. Urine seeped from the mattress onto our knees. Relatives were leaning in through the windows, anxious, listening, watching, commenting. One called across, asking me to treat his cough. I told him where to find the clinic. As we passed the nurse on her drug round, a man from the other half of the ward pulled at my coat sleeve. Help me. The nurse told him that someone would see him later. The second bay was pneumonia, tuberculosis, jaundice. Another patient was tapping my shoulder and demanding that I help with his stomach pains. We hastened through several cases of chronic cough in the last bay and were done. I issued a closing pep talk and turned to leave. Passing the noisy relatives, I felt an insistent tug on my coat hem. Not again. I whipped round, suddenly angry and impatient to get out. It was one of the patients on the floor in the second bay. Could he not see how hard we'd worked? I didn't bother to conceal my irritation and said, I've already heard your problem. What do you want now? He looked up at me earnestly. Nothing, doctor. You look tired. I think you can share my beans. He pushed his watery hospital meal on its plastic plate across the concrete floor towards me. I had seen the face of Christ. That's the intimacy. It should choke you up with the intimacy and grace of God. How do you get that interplay of awe and intimacy for which the official word is revelation? By talking about the Bible. Duh. Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? Say the disciples on the road to Emmaus. By opening the scriptures, you are saying the Bible is God's limitless gift. You, that's to say the whole church, can receive it. It's not just for theology professors, for pious people with daily 2-hour quiet times and leather-bound dog-eared tomes, for charismatic people who see God's healing hand 17 times a day. It's for every Christian. And part of the way you say that is to preach on the Old Testament. Read my lips. Preach on the Old Testament. The great thing about the Old Testament is it really is news to most of our congregations. And if truth be told, to most of us preachers. So you're all the more likely to get people saying, I never realized. I had no idea. And if you're sitting thinking, but I don't know the Old Testament very well, then I'm saying, you've got preaching completely wrong. Preaching isn't telling people what you've long known. It's inviting people into the mystery of what you're in the process of discovering. I truly believe God has given us everything we need to be disciples, ministers, and missionaries. Our problem is not that God hasn't given enough, but we choose not to use what God has given us. If you've never preached a sermon on the book of Ezekiel, then I rest my case. Preparing, section 2. So the first principle of preaching is you want to communicate the awesomeness and yet the intimacy of God. And the second principle is that the Bible seems small and far away, but turns out to reveal to us everything we need. Now it's time to turn to the readings for the day. Gently, tenderly, and prayerfully, you read through the 3 or 4 readings assigned for a conventional Sunday or festival service, and deep in your heart, you listen to the things that give you a jolt because they surprise you, delight you, confuse you, or trouble you. What is it, reading this, that bothers me, that I can't wriggle out of, that moves my soul, that maybe in a half dozen words says it all? You have the beginning of a powerful sermon if you have the courage to stay in that place till revelation comes. Scriptural commentaries will usually focus and drill down those gut reactions, and they may evoke new points of joy, dread, wonder, or fascination. I usually try to read between 5 and 10 commentaries on every passage I'm planning to preach. Sooner or later, something will go ping. And I know I have to explore it, dig into it, relish it, ponder it, shake it, till it gives up its gold coin. Then I'll usually go in one of 2 directions. Either I'll focus in on just a handful of words that seem to demand exploration, or I'll look at a whole story or episode to examine its structure and what shape that may give that's of larger significance. From then I start to build a plan for a sermon that develops an argument. It's not a sermon unless it has an argument. Most of my sermons come in one of 2 forms. Either they establish a problem and by stages resolve it, or they identify a mystery and gradually enter and enjoy it. The sermon I just preached was of the second kind, entering the mystery. It should go without saying that the sermon should go with the rhythm and grain of the text. But I can't tell you how many sermons I've listened to that don't. It's unfortunately common to hear a sermon that's somehow an organized protest against the text, that communicates the preacher's discomfort with what the text is saying and somehow regards that as salutary for the congregation to hear. Discomfort with the text is fine, but that's for the time of preparation, not for the time of writing. Keep wrestling and share with the congregation what you find. The wrestling itself is not interesting. It's also regrettably common to hear a sermon that uses a scriptural text as the beginning of a kind of thematic word association, a kind of improvisation game where the preacher clusters together a bunch of anecdotes or illustrations that seem relevant or resonant with this story or sentence. Both of these aberrations fail to go with the grain and rhythm of the text. They make preaching harder than it needs to be and leave the congregation thinking discipleship is rather more complex and unappealing than they might have thought when the sermon began. Here are 4 principles I try never to deviate from in preparing a sermon. Number 1, work out the last line and write it down on a piece of paper before you write the first line of the sermon. You may have a structure that makes an argument, then outlines some implications, but it should almost always end by returning to a clinching climax. If your argument has established a problem and by stages resolved it, your last line will probably be a carefully crafted revelation. If your argument has identified a mystery and gradually entered and enjoyed it, your last line will probably be a careful repeat of what you've already said. My sermon just now was of that latter kind. Number 2, structure your argument. In practice, you've got broadly 2 options. Either you start with the text, and then, having identified the key point in the text, you come out of it and explore that point in discipleship, ministry, or mission. Or you start outside the text and spend your opening remarks identifying the point in question, and then flip to the text to see that the text is about to disclose hidden truth and depth to amplify that point. My sermon just now took that latter course. If your argument is carefully structured, then your congregation will have no difficulty in following it. And if the point is existentially vital, then they'll be hanging on to your every word. Number 3, don't start writing until you have the whole argument and the last line. Start when you can't wait. If you're not bursting to tell the congregation the good news that you discovered in your preparation and reflection, then you're probably not ready to start writing. The idea that it will somehow come to you when you're in the process of writing is almost always a fantasy. Number 4, illustrations must advance your argument, not deepen the problem or amplify your starting point. Far too often preachers use illustrations that distract from, confuse, or even contradict the point they're making. A sermon isn't an assemblage of random information relevant to a subject. It's an unveiling of the Holy of Holies, from outside and downhearted to face with God and beholding the glory. The distracting illustration is almost always a sign that the preacher deep down has lost confidence in his or her argument and settles for amusing or interesting his congregation rather than transforming them. The question of anecdotal or literary or personal reference probably takes me more time than any other part of the preparation. I simply sit in a chair, close my eyes, and ponder as deeply as I know what connection, typology, event, or story this point deeply resonates with, and then try to be as rigorous and patient and honest as I can in discerning whether the story is apposite, appropriate, and mine to tell. Before leaving this phase, I should say that not all my sermons are exegetical. About 1 time in 5, I'll depart from the method I've outlined and respond to a pressing or topical issue in community, church, or world. You get the right to do that if people trust that you've opened their eyes and heart and souls to the glory. You don't get to do that if you've lost confidence in the Bible or your ability to glean joy from it and settle for preaching newspaper editorials or blogs instead. Number 3, writing and revising. By this stage, I hope it's clear that most of the real work has been done. As I write, I'm sticking pretty closely to my prepared structure and building up to my last line. Then as I revise, I have 4 questions in my mind, and these are perhaps the key ones in going from good to great. The first is, does the sermon show real nuance of the complexity of faith and the texture of life? In today's sermon, I try to bring this out by highlighting the difference between the terms precious, honoured, and loved, and dwelling carefully on what it means to be loved but not honoured, or honoured but not loved. If your congregation trusts that you see the true complexity of faith and life, they will trust the resolution you offer to the struggles they all too well know. The second is, how is my tone of voice? Do I sound generous-hearted, compassionate, gentle, yet clear? Or is there a harshness, a throwaway recklessness, a judgmental denunciation, a superficial generalization that could undermine all the good things I want people to hear and cherish? Do I sound clever or wise? Is my illustration about myself attention-seeking or a subtle form of boasting or self-promotion? Could I tell the same story as if it were about someone else to equally good effect? Are all the examples about men? Is the humour laughing with or at? The third question is my argument moving at the right pace? I may be very familiar with the fact that Israel went into exile or that Jesus' choice of 12 disciples corresponds with Israel's 12 tribes, but am I racing too fast for the congregation to keep up? When I get to my key points, have I prepared the listener to know that this is the big moment or structured in a sufficient element of surprise? Is there enough lightness of touch to help the listener maintain concentration throughout? Are there enough signposts to ensure the listener never gets lost? Am I unwise to be making a 4-step argument, and could I do all I need to do in 3? Is there anything the congregation need to have in their hands to help them grasp what I'm doing? Can the choice of hymns or anthems or the theme of intercessions or introductions complement what I'm planning to say? Fourth, what single thing do I want the listener to be humming, praying, repeating, treasuring a day, a week, or a decade later? What will be the memorable takeaway? Surely not, try harder to love your daughter. Just now it was very simple. You are precious, honored, and loved, and so is Israel, and so is Jesus. How do I make that simplicity so elegant it's infectious and irresistible? Number 4, delivering. Finally, a sermon isn't fundamentally a written document, but the event of reading out or relaying a love letter. Delivering should be about conveying a letter drenched in love from God to the congregation. You are speaking to the people for God. The congregation should feel like it. When you're bringing good news, smile. When you're saying hard things, say them tenderly and gently. Don't be embarrassed. You don't need to earn the listener's respect. You have, in some formal or informal way, been commissioned to do this today or regularly. Enjoy the privilege and fulfill the responsibility to the utmost of your ability. Make this the best sermon you've ever preached. And if you fear the text isn't your very best, make the delivery your very best. Don't reveal your discomfort or insecurity by making unnecessary jokes or comments as you begin that don't add to what you've truly got to say. If it's really necessary to acknowledge someone for inviting you or some such other introductory remark, clearly distance that from the sermon itself by saying your invocation after your opening comments to indicate a significant change of mood. Don't ad-lib offhand comments, however humorous. I was guilty today. As you go along, it's very unlikely they'll be as valuable as what you've prepared, and they may be catastrophically, if unintentionally, hurtful, offensive, or inappropriate. Most of the things I've regretted saying in sermons have been off the cuff, often in relation to an unexpected noise interruption or equipment failure. Take your time, trust you have something blessed to say, and cherish the words that may be familiar to you but are fresh and life-giving to the congregation. And recognize the value of eye contact. It's not necessary to have eye contact with everybody all the time. I used to use a text only very seldom, so as to maximize the intensity and immediacy of what I was saying. But I came to realize how much people engage with a sermon by reading it again later, or by reading it without having been there at its actual delivery. And for those experiences, you need to provide a text. But you can have the best of both worlds if you're sure to memorize key sentences, most obviously, your last line. I want to finish with 2 uncompromising statements in answer to the 2 most common reactions to what I'm saying. The first reaction is, I don't have the ability. I say, I bet you drive a car. The first time you sat in the driver's seat, I bet, like me, you had no idea what you were doing. In my case, I drove into a hedge, and even 3 weeks after I passed my test, I wrote off a car by not looking where I was going. A car can do immense damage. So can a sermon. A car can also take you to the most beautiful and precious and wonderful places in the world. So can a sermon. What's the secret? Stick to the rules, keep filling it with petrol, and get better at it. The second reaction is, I haven't got the time. I say, the awesome God of heaven and earth longs to be revealed in all intimacy to the people who are pining to behold the glory and be transformed by the renewing of their hearts and minds and souls and lives. And you have been called, commissioned, and given the priceless opportunity to be the messenger of that wondrous story. And you've got more important things to do. Really? We've got 10 minutes for questions.